The federal Liberals and NDP are stepping up their demands that a full independent inquiry be called into allegations of abuse of Afghan prisoners.
Why won't the government help Canadians get the whole truth in this matter through a full, independent judicial inquiry?
In his testimony before the committee earlier this week, Mr. Colvin confirmed that he never witnessed abuse firsthand. Mr. Speaker, his allegations are nothing short of hearsay, sometimes second or even third-hand information.
Former Canadian diplomat Richard Colvin testified officials are either ignored or downplayed his reports about the abuse of detainees. Colvin telling a Commons committee this past week that many Afghan prisoners had been tortured after they were handed over by Canadian troops to Afghan security. While calls for an inquiry continue from Parliament Hill, the government has set its sights on the whistleblower himself, Richard Colvin. The Tories have repeatedly said his testimony is not credible. David Hutton is the executive director of FAIR, the Federal Accountability Initiative for Reform, which is an organization that encourages whistleblowers to speak out. He's on the line with us from London. Mr. Hutton, before we get to the specifics of Mr. Colvin, I wonder if you can tell us what Canada's record is when it comes to handling its whistleblowers.
Brad, it's a pretty appalling record. We theoretically have some laws that are supposed to protect them, but these seem to be really just for show, and the way that Canadian whistleblowers are treated is absolutely appalling. And I can cite you some examples. I think that the case that people should be looking at if they want to understand what's likely to happen to Richard Colvin is the case of Joanna Galtieri, who was also with Foreign Affairs and who raised concerns in the early 90s about extravagance and wasteful spending in their accommodations for diplomats abroad, and her case is still before the court. She's still fighting the government in court, and there's no sign of her case coming to trial, and she's been subject to all the kinds of harassment and reprisals that typically happen to whistleblowers, and her case is typical. The only thing that's unusual about it is that she's still standing and still fighting.
Specific to the case of Richard Colvin now, the man that we see in these pictures that we're showing, the Conservative government is attacking Colvin's credibility outright, even suggesting his testimony aided the Taliban. Defense Minister Peter MacKay, however, made it clear yesterday that Richard Colvin will not be punished for his testimony. Where do you think this will go for him, Mr. Hutton?
Well, his claim that he won't be punished is kind of laughable because the government is doing everything in its power to punish people who have previously spoken up in similar fashions, and they continue to do this. They are obviously not going to turn around and fire him now, not when he has this high profile, but he's already been subject to reprisals in the sense that the Justice Department seems to have done everything in its power to restrict his access to legal counsel, even though they have intentionally put him in an extremely difficult position of double jeopardy, if you like, where he could go to jail if he refused to testify to the Military Police Complaints Commission, and he could go to jail if he does testify. That's the type of position that they have put him in, and that's why the other 22 people who were subpoenaed to testify to the Commission on this issue, the other 21 backed out.
And Mr. Hutton, I think it seems pretty obvious that this is going to have a dampening effect on anyone else who ever considers stepping forward as a whistleblower.
Oh, absolutely. And people need to understand how extraordinarily courageous this man has been, because he is fully aware of the situation he's stepping into and the intensity of the feeling against him by senior people in government. And so it's extraordinary that he would come forward in this way. And I think people should also bear in mind that this was not someone going out there looking for a fight or to embarrass the government. On the contrary, this was someone who, by doing his job properly, was trying to keep our troops safe, to protect the success of our mission in Afghanistan, and also to keep the government out of trouble. The reason they're in trouble now is because they simply ignored his reports and tried, in fact, to suppress them from quite an early stage.
Testimony this week by whistleblowing diplomat Richard Colvin to his Ottawa superiors, putting the Conservative government on the defensive amid opposition calls for an official inquiry. David Hutton, the executive director of FAIR, an organization that encourages whistleblowers to speak out, speaking with us from London. Good talking to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.